Good afternoon. Welcome to UW-Madison's Division of Extension Badger Dairy Insights. The Badger Dairy Insights series is part of our Farm Ready Research winter programming for agriculture. Today's session is Animal Care on the Farm and Beyond. My name is Jim Versweveld. I am the Agriculture Educator for Walworth County, and I'll be your moderator today. We'd ask that you please mute your microphones during today's presentation, as it will improve audio quality for all participants. The mute icon should be in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. If you see a line through the microphone graphic, your line is muted. We encourage your questions during today's session. Please use the chat feature in the bottom center of your screen to type in questions that you have during the program. Today's program features two speakers who will provide valuable insights on managing your dairy herd, both on and off the farm. Our first speaker, Dr. Jennifer Van Oss, will present animal welfare, essential for the cow, the producer, and the consumer. Jennifer is an assistant professor and extension specialist in animal welfare on the faculty of the Department of Dairy Science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Van Oss received her PhD in interdisciplinary animal behavior graduate program at UC Davis and conducted postdoctoral research in the animal welfare program at the University of British Columbia. The research in her lab at UW-Madison focuses on understanding, evaluating, and improving the welfare of dairy animals from a biological perspective. The goal of Dr. Van Oss's extension program is to promote best practices in management and housing to help the dairy industry adapt as our scientific knowledge about animal welfare continues to grow. Following Jennifer, Aerica Bjurstrom will present the Silver Hour, transitioning from a dairy cow to a market cow. Aerica is the agriculture agent for Extension Kewaunee County. She's been in her role for 14 years and has primarily focused on dairy worker safety, herd health, and meat animal production. Prior to joining Extension, Aerica worked at Bomatic, Accelerated Genetics, and Excel Meats. She has a bachelor's degree in animal science from UW-Madison and a master's degree in education. Before we get started, I'd like to take just a moment to recognize the rest of our extension team contributing to today's program. Tina Coleman is the Dairy and Livestock Agent for Fond du Lac County. Sarah Grochin is the Dairy and Livestock Educator from Outagamie County. Amanda Young is the Dairy and Livestock Educator for Dodge County, and Lissa Seefeld is the Agriculture Educator from Eau Claire County. On behalf of our team, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. And with that, we are ready to begin today's presentation. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Jim, for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about animal welfare, which is my area of specialty for research and extension. And I'm just hoping that this talk can provide some food for thought for people to ruminate on and hopefully spark some lively discussion. So just to set the stage, I want to talk a little bit about animal welfare as a scientific discipline, and then we'll go into a little bit more depth about the insights that this type of research can provide us. So animal welfare science is what's been called a so-called mandated science. What this means is that when we do research in animal welfare, our motivations aren't just for new scientific discoveries, but also because this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in. So it's motivated also by societal interest in this concept. And animal welfare is a concept that's been called part of this term social license. So what that refers to is that for the dairy industry to continue to succeed into the future and maintain its so-called social license to sell milk, then consumers have to not only find the products that we produce to be palatable, but also the practices with which they're produced. So how are the animals raised? So our potential consumers want to feel good about what they're buying and how those animals were treated. And of course, we know that more and more of our potential consumers today don't grow up on a farm, aren't very close to farming practices. And we also know that they have a lot of choices when they go to the grocery store or to restaurants, and they might choose not to consume dairy products. So how do we keep them feeling good about their choices? How do we keep them feeling good about consuming dairy products? And so this is what maintaining the social license means. It means keeping people interested in feeling good about these choices. So just to illustrate how these societal interests have been changing over time, this is just a brief timeline showing some of the state ballot initiatives that relate to farm animal housing. So on the left side, you can see in 1988 in Massachusetts, about 3/4 of voters voted no. They did not want to establish new laws about farm animal housing in that state. But then you can see in the last 20 years, there's this societal shift in how people are thinking about farm animal care. So starting in 2002 in Florida, this legislation did pass. And then there was a landmark ballot proposition in 2008 in California, where in addition to gestation crates for sows and veal crates for calves, this time the legislation also included getting rid of battery cages for egg-laying hens. And then further to the right, you can see in Massachusetts, about 30 years after this initial proposition that did not pass, now 2/3 of those more recent voters said, yes, we should pass laws that regulate farm animal housing. So what you can see from this timeline is that these state laws on farm animal housing are relatively uncommon. We have no federal regulations about farm animal housing, but this timeline does illustrate the shift in societal thinking and interest in animal welfare. And it illustrates this concept of social license where regulations are increasing. Most of the time, however, they're not legislatively mandated, and instead we're seeing changes within the supply chain, where this concept of corporate social responsibility is shaping animal care expectations that then reflect back to the farm. And so social responsibility in these companies can reflect a lot of different values. So sometimes if you go to these companies' websites, they have statements about their philosophy in relation to environmental impact, or animal welfare, or the way the workers or suppliers are treated, but animal welfare can fall under this umbrella. So just as an illustrative example, I have this public commitment from McDonald's a few years ago where they were transitioning their supplier expectations to do away with conventional battery cages for their egg-laying hens and to transition to cage-free housing. So of course, when a large corporation like this takes such a stance, it sets the stage for other companies to follow. And this is what's really causing this shift in expectations about farm animal care in the US and globally. So this is meant to illustrate that animal welfare is something a lot of different parties are interested in. So who is part of this conversation? So first of all, we have the producers, who are the ones raising the animals and harvesting the products. And then these products get to our end consumers through these companies in the supply chain that process and manufacture and market these products. It's also important to remember that consumers can wear a different hat as potential voters and influence possible legislation. So then these expectations trickle back to farmers, whether it's coming from legislation or from standards in the supply chain where these companies make commitments about their expectations. So product flows one way, but expectations can go the other way. And this graph is just meant to illustrate that consumers are thinking more about animal welfare nowadays. Of course, there's many attributes that affect their decision-making at the store or in the restaurant. So there are other attributes such as the price of the food item, food safety, the taste, nutritional value that are on average ranked ahead of animal welfare. But critically, animal welfare does come ahead of other potential priorities. So this can include the environmental impact of the way the products are produced, labor fairness, etc. So this is something that is on people's minds nowadays. So now I do want to just pause and define what is animal welfare. It's something that we hear talked about a lot, but I think there's a lot of confusion around the term that can cause emotions to run high. So when we think about this word, welfare, sometimes in the industry we say well-being, but it's really referring to the same thing. So how well is an animal faring? It's describing that animal's state or what it's experiencing. So a cow could have good welfare, or she could experience poor welfare, or something in between. So when we study animal welfare scientifically, we're asking, how is this animal faring? And so we're looking at these animal-based outcomes. And I'll come back to this in a moment. One important distinction is that animal welfare does not mean animal rights. And so I think these two terms often get used interchangeably or get confused, but they really mean different things. So there is one thing these terms have in common, which is people who hold an animal rights view and people who hold an animal welfare view both think that we as humans have some kind of direct ethical obligation to animals, whereas there are people who have a stance that humans have no responsibilities towards animals or no ethical obligation. But that's where the similarities end. So people with animal rights views, at least on the most extreme end, believe that animals have their own inherent individual rights. So what that means to them is that it's not justifiable to sacrifice the interest of a given animal to benefit another animal or humans. And so that animal has its own rights that can't be violated. And if you contrast that, animal welfare means that we recognize that humans do manage animals under our care for various purposes, but then the goal is to maximize the quality of life that those animals experience. So to people who believe in animal welfare, such as myself, the idea is, yes, we have a responsibility and an ethical obligation to the animals under our care, but that can be okay as long as we do so and keep in mind the animal's interests. So going back to this diagram, who's part of this conversation on animal welfare, we do need to acknowledge, of course, these activist organizations and their celebrity spokespeople are part of the conversation. So even when they believe in animal rights, they still participate in conversations about animal welfare. And so these groups do actively try to influence both the end consumers themselves as well as potential voters. And they also directly try to influence these companies within the supply chain to affect the practices on the farm. The difference is what they're trying to accomplish. So people who believe in animal welfare try to influence these companies in the supply chain to maximize the quality of life of the animals on the farm. Whereas with these activist groups, they're actually trying to make it more difficult for farmers to continue to stay in business. And by doing that, they're hoping to end animal agriculture. So those motivations are very different, even though they're part of the same conversation. So I want to emphasize that our goal as a dairy industry should indeed be to provide high quality animal care and maintain a high professional bar for ourselves and to seek to follow best practices based on scientific research. But the key is that this isn't about trying to appease these animal rights activist groups, because there's no such thing. These ideas are incompatible because these organizations want to see animal agriculture end, whereas the goal that we have is to maintain that social license and to be sustainable and successful into the future. So a common tactic that these activist groups use is filming undercover videos and then launching publicity campaigns to accompany them to try to reduce public trust and erode this concept of social license and get consumers to get turned off from consuming animal products. And it can be tempting to want to outlaw these practices and say we should ban people from filming these videos and releasing them. And so in response, there have been some laws created to do so. These are also known as ag-gag laws. And a recent study investigated, well, what happens when you tell people about these ag-gag laws? And unfortunately, this erodes credibility in farming. So outlawing these videos isn't the answer, even though of course it's tragic when these videos happen. So the graph is just depicting when people in the study were given two scenarios, one in which they were told about ag-gag laws and one in which they weren't. They found that the level of trust in farming went down. And the really interesting thing is that this was regardless of the people's demographics. So regardless of their political affiliations, whether they lived in urban or rural areas, and also regardless of whether they were already consumers of animal products or not, when they felt like farmers had something to hide, that's how they interpreted these laws, and that ruined the credibility. So a key here is that we do need to maintain transparency and not try to hide what goes on the farm. So instead, I think that a key is to focus on building trust through the types of conversations that we have and the messages that we send to consumers to show that we do really care about animal welfare. So it's about addressing the expectations of our potential consumers and voters and maintaining their confidence to maintain the social license. And so the key is to keep in mind these people and not the activists, because it's not possible to satisfy them. So then how do we maintain a high bar for ourselves and decide what these best practices should be? And so the good news is that producers do have allies in their veterinarians, as well as animal welfare scientists such as myself and others. So more of these companies and supply chain realize that the conversation shouldn't just be dictated by consumers who are far removed from ag or by these activist organizations. And now they are turning to scientific advisors. So many of my colleagues and myself do participate in these advisory boards to try to bring scientific evidence to the conversation, as well as to talk about the practical realities on the farm and what producers deal with in raising their animals. So to summarize, I think that animal welfare plays a really key role on the farm because this type of scientific research helps us understand the animal's perspective, first of all. So what does the dairy cow or a dairy calf need to have to experience good welfare? And then we can also do research to understand the people side. So what are the expectations of various stakeholders, whether they are potential consumers or dairy farmers or veterinarians? And then how do we reconcile these things? So how do we provide for the animal's needs to maximize their welfare and also address people's expectations? And so we can look at animal welfare using different scientific techniques. So I'm trained in animal behavior and animal biology, and primarily I seek to understand the animal's perspective, but I also collaborate with social scientists who are trained in understanding the people side of the equation, so we can understand people's expectations and their values. So for the rest of this talk, I will mainly be talking about the social science side, but I do think in order to introduce that, I need to establish a framework for the animal perspective of animal welfare. So when we talk about animal welfare versus animal care consists of all these various inputs that we as human beings provide to the animals under our care. So we have the environment that the cows are kept in, so their housing and facilities, we have our management practices, and then we have the direct way that we handle them, or stockmanship. All of these things combine to affect this animal welfare outcome. So is the cow in a state of good welfare, poor welfare, or in between, depending on the care that we provide. And there are a lot of different ways to think about what is important in terms of these inputs. So this is just one common framework. So when we think about animal welfare, a lot of times people talk about the animal's health. So is she healthy? Does she lack the presence of disease? Does she lack the presence of injury? So this is clearly very critical to an animal's welfare. And then we often talk about nutritional aspects. So does the cow have sufficient quality and quantity of both water and feed? We can also examine aspects of the environment. So this is basically cow comfort. So is she in a good temperature or relative humidity situation for the climate? What's the air quality? What kind of shelter does she have from environmental extremes? Other aspects of facility design. I think an area that's sometimes more overlooked, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is the animal's behavioral well-being. And so this is where it's really important to understand a given species to know, do they have the ability to do things that are important to them? So are there choices in the environment that are relevant to them? Is there a variety of situations that they can experience? Do they have social contact with others of their kind? And the reason all of these things matter is because they affect the animal's state. And so the term for this in the scientific research is affective state, but you can also think of it as their mental or emotional state, or what the animal subjectively experiences. And I just want to pause here to emphasize, we're not talking about anthropomorphism, which is basically projecting our human experiences onto cows, or making an equivalence between cows and humans. Instead, it's really about understanding that species and that life stage and what they might be experiencing. So this is why people care about animal welfare, because there are, of course, people who study plant pathology or plant productivity, and that's, of course, super relevant to agriculture, but plants don't have feelings, and so we don't worry about our ethical obligation to them. Whereas with animals, we know that they can have negative or positive experiences. So again, this isn't about projecting our human emotions onto them. We're not talking about cows being jealous. We're just saying that enough research has validated that cows can experience pain or fear. We want to minimize those negative states. And on the flip side, promote positive states. So what causes them to feel comfort or contentment? So I'm introducing this because I'll bring this up again later in the context of what consumers tend to expect regarding animal welfare. So coming back to the human side of animal welfare science, where are consumers today getting information about animal welfare? So sometimes people might vote for regulations or support restrictions on farm animal care, maybe because they don't have a source of information on animal welfare. So one study found that people who responded to a survey, more than half of them said they didn't have any kind of reliable source for information about farm animal welfare. Among the other half of people who did have a source, 40% of those actually said that to them, animal rights organizations were where they primarily got information about animal welfare. And this is a bit alarming because, as we discussed earlier, the motivations of these organizations are not to promote animal welfare or to maintain the social license of the food animal industry. But I think the reason this happens is because other studies have shown that sometimes there is an inverse relationship between a perceived vested financial interest and credibility. So that means that people might trust a nonprofit organization, even if the purpose isn't to promote animal welfare. So as farmers, you have a vested financial interest, and that can sometimes conflict with perceived trust or credibility. In this particular study, they were focused mainly on pork consumption rather than dairy, but they did ask a question about whether concerns about animal welfare were affecting their purchasing decisions. And about 20% of people said yes, they had reduced their pork consumption in the last 3 years due to animal welfare concerns. So this is evidence that can be alarming for this idea of social license, where if people are concerned about animal welfare, they might be getting turned off as potential consumers. So I would like to ask a poll question. So the question which you can respond to is, what is your preferred way to interact with consumers about either your farm or ag practices in general? So the options are in person, for example, farm tours or breakfast on the farm. The second option is online. So maybe you have a farm website or social media accounts. The third option is through membership in ag organizations. So maybe those organizations are launching marketing campaigns or doing some lobbying. And the final option is no interaction. So you prefer not to engage directly with non-ag consumers and fly under the radar. So about 2/3 of people have responded. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling. So it looks like the most common response is that people prefer to engage in person, followed by online or through membership in organizations, and very few people prefer not to have any interaction. So that's really fascinating. So it sounds like a lot of people like to have this face-to-face, in-person interaction. Okay, so I think a lot of us have heard the messaging in the industry that we need to get better as an industry about telling our story. This point gets hammered home all the time. And because evidence has shown that a lot of consumers aren't getting any information, or they're getting poor conflicting information, it's tempting to see why we're told this. So the quote I have here is hypothetical. It just summarizes what I hear oftentimes in the industry, which is consumers today, they're really separated from ag. They don't understand how their food is produced. So maybe we do need to just tell our story better, so that way they'll learn more about how things are done and then accept that we are caring for our animals. But some of the research suggests that the story isn't so straightforward. So telling our story and educating consumers better is not the single solution to resolving their potential concerns. So I'm going to walk you through one study that was pretty powerful, where they took advantage of an annual farm tour that had a stop at a research dairy. And so this was nearly 1,000 people who'd come every year on their bicycles on this slow food tour. So these were people who were consumers of dairy products. They were interested in learning more. And so what this researcher did, Beth Ventura, who's now at University of Minnesota, she asked them, are you willing to participate in a study? So they were given a baseline quiz about their knowledge about dairy farming. And then after they walked through the tour and all the educational stations, they were quizzed again to see, did they actually learn more about the dairy industry? And she also asked them, what are your thoughts about animal welfare and dairy farms? Are there questions that you have? And then again, asked that at the end. So what she found was that, yes, by going through this educational farm tour, people's knowledge about dairy production practices improved. So they learned more about how cows are raised. So this educational tour did work to convey facts about dairy farming. But what was less clear was how this affected how they perceived animal welfare on dairy farms. So it didn't improve for everybody. And so that the idea that telling our story will help consumers trust us more doesn't always hold water. So this is a graph showing the effects that it had on these different participants. So for a quarter of people after the farm tour, they did have better perceptions of animal welfare in dairy farms. But unfortunately, a third of people actually became more worried or more critical about animal welfare on dairy farms. And a little less than half of people had no change in their perceptions. And so part of what's happening here is that providing the facts and educating people isn't always enough, because people don't just function on logic and facts, their emotions and their values matter too. So that's what I'll walk you through next. So going back to this framework that I showed earlier about animal welfare, there are some shared values between producers and consumers around these physical aspects of the animal's wellness, so health and nutrition. So from a different study with a focus group of farmers, this is one example quote where a producer said that provision of adequate supplies, such as food and water, together with good health care makes for good welfare. And so this is sort of a representative sentiment. And likewise, before this farm tour, about 3/4 of people had expressed some questions about the cow's physical health. So are they getting good nutrition? Are they healthy? Are the cows uninjured? So this shows that there is common ground between producers and consumers around health. So this is an area where we're on the same page. And this can explain why about a quarter of these people had improved perceptions of welfare, because seeing the farm alleviated their concerns about the cow's physical well-being. So this is really good news. This is an area of common ground where we can launch conversations and show we care about the same things. But of course, that doesn't mean there isn't work to be done. So various papers have looked at priorities as reported by dairy producers or veterinarians or animal welfare scientists. And it seems like everybody recognizes that we still have some work to do when it comes to reducing the rates of particular conditions like lameness or hock injuries, as well as diseases such as diseases affecting transition cows or pre-weaned dairy calves. So over the next couple of decades, this will continue to be a priority to try to improve the health status of our animals. In a more immediate term, similarly, we know that there are a few groups of cattle on our farms that are more at risk for issues or for negative publicity. So one of those would be bull calves, what happens to them, as well as cull or market calves, as Aerica will ask you to think of them in her presentation right after mine. And then of course, cows that become downer or non-ambulatory. So we do need to continue to focus on prevention, at least in the case of downer cows, and then the care, handling, transport, and the disposition of these animals. So when do you make these marketing decisions or euthanasia decisions as appropriate to make sure that these animals aren't suffering unduly on the farm? So the next point is that there are other aspects of animal welfare besides just their physical health. So this quote is an example where to some consumers, even though health and nutrition are super important to welfare and it's a shared value between producers and consumers, there is more to animal welfare than just health. So we'll talk about those other factors in a moment. I do have a second poll question, which is, in your opinion, Okay. In your opinion, do you think it's beneficial to use pain control medications when you're disbudding or dehorning calves? So the choices are yes, no, or I'm not sure, or don't care to answer. Okay, great. I'm going to close the polling. So it looks like about 2/3 of people said yes, it's beneficial, and the rest of people said I'm not sure. So this is pretty similar to what was found in a recent study where producers were asked about pain control. So oftentimes people recognize that there is this priority on reducing chronically painful conditions like lameness. That's why that's a priority. But also when we're thinking about temporary procedures like disbudding that can cause acute pain, so it's not a chronic condition, that a lot of producers do think that we should provide pain relief. So this is just one survey that showed the majority of producers would support this. And similarly, the majority of participants in the same survey who came from the non-ag public also thought that that would be a good idea. And so again, this is an area where the alignment is growing. And with the new expectations in the farm program to work with your veterinarian to provide some kind of pain control, this is an area where we can make a lot of inroads, and the values between consumers and producers are quickly closing that gap. So to summarize, from these same studies that have tried to identify the top priorities for dairy animal welfare, whether it's from the producer perspective or veterinarians or scientists, in the immediate term, there should be a focus on avoiding abuse or mishandling. So true abuse is thankfully quite rare, but inappropriate handling can happen due to things like a lack of training. So there are new expectations in the farm program about documenting annual continuing education in terms of stockmanship, and then also new expectations about painful procedures. So a few years ago, tail locking was phased out, and now with disbudding and dehorning, there is a new expectation that you work with your vet to implement some kind of pain control protocol. And the goal here is to implement these best practices that are supported by scientific research. And this again allows for this alignment between consumer expectations and then producer viewpoints as well, where this gap is quickly closing. One thing to note, though, is that everything we've talked about so far is about alleviating potential suffering or negative states in the animals. So basically, we're taking them from a state of poor welfare to kind of a baseline where they're not suffering. But a recent paper had this quote, which said, "A lack of negative welfare conditions does not necessarily mean that animals are in good welfare and have a good quality of life." So if we're trying to assure consumers that these animals have a life worth living and that we're maximizing their quality of life, we might want to think about other aspects of welfare as well. So I have one last poll question for you, which is, I introduced this concept earlier of behavioral well-being. So from your perspective, how important do you consider that to be relative to other aspects of welfare, whether that's physical health or pain? So do you think behavioral well-being is at least as important, equally as important, not as important, but still a consideration, or not at all important? Okay, I'm gonna end the polling. All right, thanks for participating. So interestingly, about 2/3 of people said that they think behavioral well-being is equally as important as other aspects of welfare. And a few people said it's at least as important, and some said not as important, but still a consideration. So that's fascinating. I'm excited to see these results because there's a little bit less known about this idea. So this is an area that's been identified as potentially where the values in the ag industry and the values outside of it might diverge more, but according to this group, maybe they're not so different. I think that's actually really exciting and promising. So oftentimes, consumers will have questions about things like behavioral opportunities, outdoor pasture access. Do cows have access to friends? And I think sometimes in the industry, we de-emphasize this, at least in our conversations about welfare. And so in the case of this farm tour example, before the tour, 66% of visitors came up with these questions about behavioral well-being. And for those people, that often explained why, after the tour, they felt more critical of how the cows were being raised on this farm. And so this showed a gap or a divergence of values between the farm and these potential consumers, because oftentimes people had gone in with questions like, do the cows have pasture access? And when they found that the answer was no, they were disappointed and they became more critical. At the same time, sometimes people took these tours and they became aware of practices they didn't know about before, such as routinely removing the calf from the dam when it's born, and that caused them to have new questions or concerns that they didn't have before. So I think these questions around behavioral well-being are really important, because even if the animals aren't in a state of negative welfare, there are a lot of questions about whether or not they're able to express these important behaviors. So these types of topics have also come up in these focus groups and surveys of people in the industry. So over the next couple decades, there are questions about how can we reduce restriction of movement or certain postures and behaviors. So we see this reflected in the state legislation. So we see a phasing out of battery cages, gestation crates, veal crates. These all have to do with this concept of restriction of movement. And even though there's no restrictions there's no legislation for adult dairy cows, we can at least draw some insights from these patterns and say, this is something we ought to be talking about. So the conversation has been about phasing out the most restrictive housing. So not banning any type of housing, but just saying, going forward, when we're renovating or building new facilities, we need to keep in mind this idea of behavioral freedom. Included in this is also these concepts around cow comfort. So how do we minimize heat stress, make sure animals have enough space, have good air quality, keeping in mind principles of stall design and bedding management. In the longer term, so maybe over the next half century, I think that we need to continue these conversations about how to further increase behavioral freedoms, because there are public expectations around specific practices like pasture, outdoor access, and what do we do about cow-calf separation in particular. That has been a really hot topic. It comes up a lot from these activist groups, and I think that that's a conversation that is not going to go away on its own. So we need to start having this conversation within the industry and think creatively over the next few decades. So I just want to close with a few more additional points about communicating with potential consumers, knowing that this audience does like to engage. So sometimes if we can put on our hats and think from the perspective of somebody outside of ag, our words can land a little bit differently. So when we talk about animal care, oftentimes we're thinking about animal husbandry. So all these inputs like the facilities and the management and the handling. But oftentimes what consumers want to know is, how much do you care about your animals, not just what care you're providing. So do you feel compassion toward them? Do you care about them? And so I think connected to this is this idea where oftentimes in the industry, we wonder, why do consumers question how we care for our animals? Because it makes good business sense to treat them well. If we take care of them, then they take care of us in return. We hear this kind of rhetoric a lot. But I think that the reason this can backfire is because it frames animals as a mean to an end. So as a part of this production process, and if you flipped it around, what if you made a change to improve welfare, but it didn't improve production? Would it still be worthwhile? And so there is a good article from a couple of years ago from the DBA. I would suggest looking that up. I thought that they explained this kind of thinking well, just in terms of, if you're not involved in agribusiness, how do people interpret these kinds of statements? So I think what can work better is emphasizing this connection with the animals themselves, not just as a part of your business, but in terms of your relationship with them. So I had this conversation about a year ago with a Wisconsin dairy farm here locally that I work with sometimes. And I asked one of the owners, why do you keep dairy farming? There are other things you could do with your business. You grow crops as well to feed your animals, but why do you want to keep milking cows every day? And at first he started talking about his business and the challenges of running your own business and how exciting that can be. And I said, well, no, but why cows? Why do you work with cows? And so he quoted this Teddy Roosevelt quote about, no one cares about how much you know until they know how much you care. And so this is about conveying this idea of caring and compassion. So then he changed his answer and said, for me, I love the feeling of satisfaction I get when I walk by the pens every day before the sun comes up and I see all the cows lying down in a row in their stalls, just quietly chewing their cud. And that seeing the cows comfortable gave him that feeling of satisfaction. So I think that that's something to keep in mind, talking about how much you care about your animals and their welfare. So just as another example, this is a way to reframe the way you talk about the animals with potential consumers. And so cow brushes are one example. When I go on a farm and I see people have these fancy rotating brushes, I like to ask them, what motivated you to invest in these? Because they're not that cheap. And usually the first thing that people say is, well, we decided to buy these brushes because we care about milk quality. So when we give these cows brushes, it keeps them clean. It helps us with our somatic cell count, et cetera. They like clean cows. And that's true. But remember that this only addresses values around health and hygiene, which is important to welfare. But oftentimes consumers have questions about other aspects of welfare. So oftentimes as an afterthought, people will then say to me, oh, in addition to keeping our cows clean, our cows really seem to love them. They line up to use them, and they almost seem embarrassed. And I want to encourage you, don't be embarrassed. If you have brushes, acknowledge that you've seen that your cows like to use them, because that's something I think can really resonate with consumers, to show you're not just concerned with milk quality, which of course they want to be reassured of course it's important, but also that you care about how your cows feel. You want them to have something that they enjoy. And the good news is that that's not just made up, it is backed up by research. So there was a study that actually got attention in the New York Times a couple of years ago that showed that cows are really motivated to get access to these brushes. It's something really important to them, and we can actually quantify that. And these types of messages resonate really well with consumers because it's not something that's a stretch for them to have to understand. So just as an example, there was also a Forbes article about cow brushes. There was a feature in the Huffington Post that was about a local farm here in Wisconsin in partnership with our vet school. And you can see it got 1.5 million views and thousands of comments. And what Dr. Nigel Cook observed in looking at these comments was it's very hard for people to make a negative argument about dairy farming when they see that you're doing something nice for the cows that they enjoy. So this is a way to have positive messaging that is supported by science. And I think what it illustrates is this idea that we don't want to just eliminate suffering, we want to promote good welfare. So a quote from the same paper said, "To guarantee high welfare standards, animals should experience positive conditions that allow them to live a life that's really worth living." So again, it's not just about cow brushes, that's just one possible solution, but it's thinking about welfare holistically. So is the animal healthy, well nourished? Are they in a comfortable environment? Are they free of negative emotions? And are they able to perform important behaviors? So addressing this whole grab bag of values. And I also just want to emphasize this idea of a life worth living. I think it's important to always try to put the animal first and keep in mind her interests. And that includes making the call about when this life isn't worth living anymore. So often the merciful thing to do is to market this animal or even euthanize her. So that will help us transition to Aerica's talk next. So just to conclude, I think we should continue to really hold ourselves to a high professional standard. That's why we participate in these kinds of conversations. We want to learn the latest science. We're not here to be just good enough. We want to be the best and follow the latest science. So the dairy industry should seek to maintain this high bar and constantly improve and use the latest best practices for animal care. If you do choose to engage with consumers, think about where you can find common ground and shared values, and also show how much you care about your animals. So not just how much you know, how long you've been farming, but that you actually care about your animals and are putting them first. That can be a productive way. And then also to remember that actions do speak louder than words. So to demonstrate your caring, make sure that you are following these practices and showing what you're doing for your animals. So following these best practices informed by scientific research is good for the animals themselves, and it can also help us address these expectations throughout the supply chain and maintain consumer confidence and our social license. So if there's time, I will be happy to take some questions. If not, you can reach out to me directly. My email address is here, as well as my website, and you can follow me on Twitter. So I look forward to talking with you.
Thank you, Jennifer. There is a question in the chat. It is, how much of the state ballot initiative action can be attributed to animal rights activists who lobbied hard for changes to influence voters?
Yeah, that's a very insightful question. And largely these initiatives are pushed forth by these nonprofit animal rights organizations because it is a strategy to apply more restrictions to ag. And speaking for myself, I actually was a consumer and voter in California when Prop 2 came on the ballot originally in 2008. And I didn't know this. A lot of times these state ballot initiatives are put forth by special interest groups. And so for me at the time as a naive voter, it seemed like common sense. The way they framed it was, do you like animal cruelty? Because that would be the only reason for you to vote no. And the side against this potential initiative, I think that they could have gone a little further in their arguments because they had the chance to put through arguments about why this initiative shouldn't be passed, but they were arguing often in terms of economics, like this will drive the egg business out of the state, it will make it very difficult for egg farmers. And I think for the 98% of the population who isn't farmers, it was hard for them to relate. And in my opinion, a better strategy would have been to address animal welfare, to say, yes, we also are against animal cruelty. We have the animal's interests in mind. And here's what will happen if you phase out this type of housing. Here's the other kind of trade-offs that could happen. Here's what the research says about welfare. So absolutely, whoever said that, you're spot on. A lot of times the strategy here is from these activist groups to make it more difficult for farms to operate. But it is still relatively rare. So what's happening more is these changes in the supply chain where now we can push back and have farmers and scientists be part of that conversation. So it's not just those activist groups' voices being heard. We're now bringing the animal's voice to the conversation, the producer's voice as well. Great question.
Jennifer's topic kind of leads me into the next portion of this presentation today. And we're talking about this dairy cow who we've spent a lot of time, her entire life, hopefully making her as comfortable as possible. And now she's going to be leaving the herd. When we talk about these cows, we typically call them cull cows. To cull is something that we're trying to reduce the size. We're removing them by slaughter, especially weak or sick individuals. They're not always necessarily weak or sick, and it does have a negative connotation. So it's almost like something we discard or throw away. And we would like for dairy producers or even beef producers or whatever type of animal they are marketing, to consider those animals market animals. They are it is a positive potential for your farm. It is income. And when we talk about our market cows, they do have value, they have assets, and they're contributing to the farm income. As dairy farmers, a lot of dairy farmers don't consider themselves beef producers, but they really should. You are producing beef in the end. And according to Farm Bench, which is a division essentially, or a newer version of AGFA, if you've ever used that before, cows sold for slaughter make up about 6.6% of total farm sales. So on a dairy cow, 250 cow dairy, that could be somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 a year in income. So that's pretty substantial. And we want to make sure we're sending the best possible cow to market. Market cows create a lot of opportunities on the farm. They free up space for younger cows, better producing cows with higher genetic value. Of course, we know the highest genetic value in your herd are your youngest cows. We have reduced labor from removing those inefficient animals from the herd, feed savings from inefficient cows, and resource savings such as medication, semen, bedding, housing even, we can include in there. Cows who leave the farm fall under two categories. There's voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary would be milk production levels. They're not milking enough, or we can't get them pregnant. Involuntary, lameness, mastitis, injury, or other illnesses. So the percent of dairy cows is according to an APHIS study in 1996. So this is pretty old information, but it's pretty consistent still today. The percent of dairy cows sold for slaughter, the four big ones, of course, poor production, the udder or mastitis problems, reproductive problems, and lameness or injury. We run into a couple of other things. Disease and aggressiveness with dairy cows. We don't see aggressive cattle very often. If this were a pie chart showing beef cattle, we would probably have a lot more aggressive, a higher percent of aggressive cattle on there. But because of the nature of how dairy cows are handled so much from a very young age, we don't run into that very much. So talking about disease, the reason these cows leave the herd regarding disease, probably a lot of you would be surprised that cancer eye is quite high, 36%. Displaced abomasum, which is kind of interesting because that is something that could be intervened. You can have the vet over to fix that problem, but these producers instead chose to just ship the cow. The cow was down. Of course, now we know we can't ship down cows, lame and other. So I worked at a packing plant for a time in the early 2000s, and a lot has changed in the beef industry and the packing plant industry since then. And I, at that point, had never seen a cow with cancer eye before. And I can tell you that it was quite astonishing for me how many cows came through with cancer eye and how massive some of those tumors were on those cows. And if you've got a cow that's in that shape, she needs to be euthanized and not sent to market, because when we know this a lot about cancer, that it's not necessarily just in that one part of the body, it could be in the entire body. So Moving on with market cows, dairy cattle are estimated to be about 20 to 25% of the US beef market. So that's kind of interesting. We probably don't think about that a lot. We typically think, well, dairy cows, they're going to market, they're going to be ground beef. That's not true. According to the 2012 Beef Quality Assurance Audit, 75% of individual cow and or bull carcasses are sold as whole cuts. So whole cuts are basically an entire muscle cut. It's not ground beef, it's an entire muscle cut. So something like a tri-tip steak or a roast, shoulder roast, things like that, roast cuts. So most of them with dairy cattle, specifically dairy cows, those come from the rear legs because that's where the most muscle is on a dairy cow. They don't have a lot of muscle, so we know what little muscle they do have is on that back leg. Talking about fitness for transport, this will be Amanda, would you please launch that first poll question? So the question is before a cow is sold for slaughter, do you or a herd manager evaluate fitness for transport? It looks like most of you are evaluating for fitness or transport. Maybe some of you have never even heard of fitness or transport. Let's talk about that a little bit. I've been in extension for 14 years, as Jim said, and being somebody who has a background in meat animals, I heard a couple of things over the course of the years that made me write them down after I heard them, just because I wanted to make sure I remembered them. And the first one was, she didn't bleed out, so I guess we got lucky. They put a cow in a trailer they knew probably was going to bleed out, but she didn't. She was in bad shape and certainly not fit for transport in that case. Another one was, I can't believe that one wasn't condemned. These are animals that should not be getting on a trailer. For whatever reason, these cows had some kind of previous issues that they weren't fit for transport. She wasn't in good enough shape to make it to her final destination. And this is a picture here. Put a guy's name on here. This could be your name, it could be my name. Would you be willing to put your name and your phone number on your cow? And that way, every single place that cow went, they knew exactly where that cow came from. Would you be willing to do that? This is something that when you think of about putting a cow on a trailer, this is the kind of cow you want to be happy with you're putting on this trailer for whatever reason, but you want to make sure that you're putting a cow on there you know is going to make it all the way to her final destination. Fitness for Transport is a program from, you are probably familiar with it or maybe have heard of it through the farm program 4.0 and or beef quality assurance. As dairy producers, you are already assured, you've already done this training for fitness for transport, or at least you've done the farm training, I should say. And beef quality assurance, if some of you are just beef producers, you know that you have had to go through beef quality assurance training in order to sell to equity in recent years. All cows are sent to market. They should be sound and in good health. And this is determined by caretakers, either those people who are putting those cows on the trailer, the transporters, the people picking those cows up and or moving them, and auditors. Everybody, this is a subjective decision. So that's why we have standards to follow that by. Physical health of the cow impacts her ability to manage the trip. Just like those two cows, I can't believe it didn't bleed out. I can't believe that one wasn't condemned. Those cows were not in good enough shape to make it to her end destination. Transportation is very stressful on cattle. You're mingling them with new animals they've never dealt with before. As you know, cows really need to establish their pecking order, and they're going to do this no matter where they are, really. They are now in a situation where they have long periods of standing and or walking. Food and water is quite often deprived at this time. Their unfamiliar handling practices, new people handling them. especially with fresh cows or cows that haven't been milked for a while, they have the engorged udders injury. Sometimes they get injured during shipping. Certainly that isn't your fault, but sometimes that happens. They're in pain. Some of them are in pain. Some of them are sick. They're also subjected to extreme weather. It's either very hot or very cold. And some of them are calving. And again, like I said, I worked in a packing plant. I was really quite astonished at how many animals calve on their way to the packing plant. I saw as many as 5 calves in a day come off the trailer with the cows. There's a total of maybe 1,000 head of cattle coming in a day. It's really quite surprising to see baby calves come off the trailer with the cow. Sometimes they calved at the packing plant. Let those cows stay at home until she calves. Fitness for transport, the American Association of Bovine Practitioners has developed a set of guidelines. So we'll talk about the guidelines here. Every farm should establish a set of standards. So this is the thing where you as a dairy farmer, you as an owner, you as a herd manager or a veterinarian or whoever you are, should work with the farmer and the farm to establish this set of standards to make sure that everyone understands exactly what should be done with a cow if she's going to be shipped, if she needs to be held back, or if she needs to be euthanized. Cows leaving the herd should be ensured her welfare until harvest. So Jennifer talked a lot about the welfare of the animal on the farm, but now that they are leaving the farm, it's still your responsibility to put an animal on the trailer that's going to make it to the end. So I apologize to those of you who are colorblind. These are the colors I wanted to put on here just because red means stop, green means go. So hopefully you can see this. So these are the questions you should be asking yourself, or these are the standards you should be going over before you ship a cow. Are any udders distended? So if they are, do not ship her, milk her. That's a pretty simple solution. If she's milked, she'll be a lot more comfortable and in less discomfort as she's being transported. If she is she does not have a distended udder, you're okay to ship her. Were cows milked right before shipping? Yes, okay, you can ship her. If not, go ahead and milk her, then you can ship. Do any cows have any ambulatory issues? And this is a situation where maybe you have to euthanize this cow before, or if you need to make that decision, she needs to be euthanized, and don't ship her. If she's okay and she can get up and move around, she's fine to go. We know that the packing plants, the sale barns, they're not going to accept non-ambulatory animals. So if you're taking the risk of putting an animal that's iffy on the trailer and she goes down, guess who's not getting paid for that cow? You aren't. And now, you could have at least had her euthanized on the farm instead of putting her on a trailer and subjecting her to that. Do any cows have cancer eye or blindness? If that's the case, especially with the cancer eye, do not ship this cow. She should be euthanized. And if she looks okay in that regard, go ahead and ship. Blindness is kind of an interesting thing too. Maybe not as severe as the cancer eye, but I've seen a lot of cows that have been blind, bumping into things, running into things on the trailer, and ended up kind of mangling up their face and their eyes. It's very painful for them. At least make sure that cow has some case of vision, so she can at least see a little bit of where she's going. Do any cows have fever greater than 103? If that's the case, allow her to recover on the farm. If she doesn't have a fever, she's okay to ship. Do any cows have potential drug residues? Of course, this is a really, really big one. And I know if you're a dairy farmer out there, you're really being careful about this. Make sure that you're observing that withhold time and make sure that has passed. If you're using drugs that maybe were off label, make sure you speak to your veterinarian about whether or not that drug residue should be passed out of that cow by now. If she wasn't given any medication, she's okay to ship. Do any cows have peritonitis? If she does, of course, let her recover or euthanize. If not, go ahead and ship. Do any cows have leg fractures? or severe lameness. Leg fractures are kind of, that's very difficult. That's a situation really, if the cow has a leg fracture, she really should be euthanized on the farm. If she's okay and she does not have any issues, you go ahead and ship. Do any cows have unreduced prolapses? And this is pretty common. We've got a prolapse, can't get it back in the cow at this point. It's, really swollen. And that cow is probably in a ton of pain. And personally, we don't know how much pain that cow is in, but it's probably doesn't feel good. She doesn't feel good. Certainly when you put them into a trailer with other cows, they're being smashed up against other, in a small space up against other animals, pens, everything is much smaller for those cows to deal with. And it's uncomfortable for them to be able to have that going on. And then also you're really increasing the ability, or the risk, I should say, of that to start bleeding. And there you get a situation where that cow might bleed out. Really, those cows should be euthanized. Are there any cows currently calving or have the high likelihood of calving? Again, just let the cow have its calf on the farm, then go ahead and ship her if you need to. Do any cows have suspected nervous system issues? Allow them to recover or euthanize. And the final one is, do any cows have visible open wounds? Allow that to recover on the farm or euthanize. Okay, so who or what are you putting on the trailer? So carcass considerations, as a dairy producer or meat producer now, you are a meat producer in this case now. Farm management practices with milk cows have important implications on this cow's second career, which of course is being beef. National Beef Quality Audit said 90% of all dairy cows are too light muscled. And that's kind of a funny thing to say, because of course they're too light muscled. They're dairy cows, right? But there is a case, of course, if you put a little bit more weight on that cow, the muscle will build up on that cow. If you're sending a thin cow to market, she's going to have a very small loin eye. If you put a little bit of weight on that cow, she can actually get a bigger loin eye on her. The average body condition score of those cows is 2.3, and bruising is on 64% of cow carcasses. So these are some issues they're seeing on dairy cows. So if we look at a dairy cow, kind of just look at the size of my phone here. If you look at a dairy cow's carcass ribeye, sometimes is as small as only about half of my phone here. That's not a lot of muscle, smaller than pork chops. That's just a pretty normal looking dairy carcass. This one here, this is a dairy carcass. This is beef over here, but you can see there's not a lot of fat on them. This is not a dairy cow. This is actually a very lean dairy steer, but they're quite lean and there's not a lot of muscle on them to work with. So this next image here. All right, there it is. Hang on. There it is. All right, so this is a image of a dairy cow with a 2 body condition score. And we look at this and we think, well, that looks like a pretty typical dairy cow. Well, this dairy cow is in negative energy balance. So, she's using more calories every day than she's getting in her body. So of course she's very thin, she's losing weight. Just if you've got some cows that are going to be going to market, you can put them on a little bit of a diet that's going to put a little bit of weight on them. If you want to get a better price for your cow, certainly they do like the ones with a little bit more muscle on them, a little bit more fat. It gives them more opportunity to use that carcass. The beef quality audit showed that dairy cattle have over twice as many rear leg injection lesions than beef cattle. It's because of all the injections we give dairy cows. They get a lot of hormone shots and they're getting those shots in the wrong place. There's a big debate out there. I think veterinarians and maybe even some of the AI companies will debate whether or not that cow is getting the injection like she should be, if it's getting to where it needs to be in the cow, if you're not giving it in that rear leg. The Beef Quality Assurance wants those injections in the neck. The neck is not a very usable part of the animal. They'll use that meat, but if there's scar tissue in that, they'd rather have that back leg as a good cut with no scar tissue lesions abscesses, all of those things happen in that rear leg. And we're already talking about a pretty light muscled animal, and you're taking away with lesions and scar tissue, you're taking away the quality of that one really good cut in that cow. And a lot of that, of course, needs to be discarded. Bruising, like I said, 64% of cow carcasses have bruising on them and must be cut away. And bruising typically happens within that last 24 hours before harvest. And sometimes that happens on the farm, sometimes that happens on the trailer. Market cow transport, just because this is a big one, you know, I'm 20 miles from Green Bay, just because you have a big slaughter facility down the road doesn't mean that's where your cows are going to end up. Those cows, they could end up just about anywhere. We don't necessarily know where they will be processed. Market cattle are mixed in with animals from hundreds of other farms and unfamiliar surroundings. This is basically what a sale barn looks like. If you've never been in the back of a sale barn, this is what it looks like back there. Lots of holding pens, cows mingling in pens with other animals they don't know. Again, the beef quality audit states that market cows and bulls arriving at processing plants nationwide, on average, were in transit for 6.7 hours. There are some big slaughter cow facilities in Wisconsin, because we have a lot of cows in Wisconsin. And one's right here in the Green Bay area, one is over in central Wisconsin. And again, you know, those cows could be on the road for quite a while. A few of these loads are in transit for over 24 hours. And that's in transit. That does not mean they're sitting around or standing around or laying down in a barn like this. Transport, there is a law, the 28-hour law, which is exactly as it sounds. Livestock may not be confined for more than 28 consecutive hours without unloading the animals for feeding, water, and rest. So then that holding time at sale barns varies, but transport to slaughter facilities is typically scheduled. Again, I'll use this example in Green Bay. There is a gas station just about a mile south of one of the big packing plants, and there are almost always these trucks parked in the parking lot in the evening and overnight. I can almost guarantee you those trailers are empty, because the packing plant does not want those cattle overnight in trailers. So everything is scheduled. They know when they'll be in. They have a certain time they should be there. With some situations that they don't arrive at the right time, but for the most part, everybody arrives when they should. And that's for the cattle's benefit. The North American Meat Institute Transportation Audit Tool has criterion for acceptable wait time for a plant to unload at the plant, requiring wait time to be less than 60 minutes. With my experience with processing plants, sometimes it's well over 60 minutes. Things happen at the packing plant, one shutdown in one part of the packing plant. Of course, it's a chain. Something goes wrong in one part of the packing plant, it slows down everything all the way to the trailers waiting in the parking lot. In very hot weather, this time is likely too long. Of course, it's too much for them to handle. If you've ever been in or near those trailers, they get pretty hot inside, and they're meant, of course, to cool the animals as they're moving, not to be sitting still. Compromised cattle, so these are going to be your ones with lameness issues or other health issues. Those are all loaded in the back. You can fit 4-ish cows back here, depending on what kind they are or how big they are. And this is where they are, because if they happen to die, they're the easiest to get off the trailer in the back. However, if there is a dead animal in the back, it takes time to get those off before the rest can unload. Moving on, so the facilities at the plant and why their facilities matter to you. So why do you care about what the facilities are at the packing plant? Federal regulation requires they shall be maintained and in good repair and free from sharp and protruding objects. That's a given. I mean, we want to provide that wherever these animals are, right? We don't want to cause pain or injury to animals. And certainly if you don't have sharp and protruding objects and everything is in good repair, your workers will be safe as well. When they're not in good repair, Food and Safety Inspection Service will disallow the use of that area. So that doesn't mean that they're closing down the entire place. They're just closing down a portion of that packing plant or a portion of the barn or whatever it may be. And poorly designed facilities can lead to bruising. It's in the facility's best interest to provide the appropriate handling areas. And of course, bruising costs money because you have to trim that away and discard it. Proper flooring, just like on your farm, proper flooring and handling from unloading, or in this case, from unloading there to the knockbox. The knockbox is where the captive bolt gun is. Lairage, if you've never heard this term, lairage is the time they are spent in holding pens at the processing facility. And this is highly dependent on the facility, their speed, their space available, the number of animals to be harvested. Quite often they have a pretty decent sized holding facility where they know how many animals they can process in a day and how many they can hold, and they're sized accordingly. They are required to provide water without restriction, and I've witnessed it many, many times where these animals come off the trailer and they are fighting for water. That's unfortunate. That means they've been without water for quite some time, and fortunately they are required to provide that water. And they're also, if they're being held overnight, required to have adequate laying space if they need it. Also, some of them will feed them overnight just to keep vocalization minimal. If they're hungry, of course, they're going to vocalize, and especially if they're in a city or near houses or homes or other businesses, they don't want those animals vocalizing overnight. NAMI provides rough guidelines with suggestions for how much lairage space should be allowed, but this is not audited, so the packing plants just go off of what they can provide. So, summary, we would like for you to kind of get into that market cow mentality. This cow is not something you're throwing away. This is a valuable asset for your farm. She is income, and you want to put the best one you have on the trailer. Dairy farmers need to consider themselves beef producers from the get-go, and this includes everything, her entire life. That animal ultimately will be beef. Really get into that beef quality assurance mentality. Make sure you're giving those injections where they need to be, and which of course leads to good carcass quality. And all cows leaving the farm should be evaluated for fitness for transport. All right. And that's all I have. I just wanted to throw in one last thing here. You can follow UW-Madison's dairy team, our dairy program at UW-Madison Extension Dairy Team. We're on Facebook. We also have a website right there, extension.wisc.edu/dairy.